Hey, boys and girls and raccoons.
How's it going?
Yeah, it's going. Hello. So today we have a paper by Juan, I don't know how to say that, Galterio? Roederer. He's a professor of physics at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And he is into information and biological information. And he wrote a paper called Pragmatic Information in Biology and Physics. And he also wrote a book called Information and Its Role in Nature. And because when you read these papers on information, they're like quote mine gold for creationists, because every now and then they'll say things that can be quote mined out and indicate an intelligent designer and stuff. So I thought before we do that, we'll take just a little look at his book before we read the paper. And we're not going to read the entire paper. I think we're going to skip the quantum mechanics part of it, because he is a physicist and he gets pretty heavily into that. So
does he get into the weeds with quantum mechanics?
The what?
It was definitely weedy to me, but then again, I don't know much about it. Some of the wording confuses me because I'm not familiar with how it's used in science.
So he has a pretty small section in his book. Most of his book is he's interested in neural nets and how brains basically use information. And he calls it pragmatics quite a bit. And just so we don't get off course, we must read. There is a quote mine for us. There's no need to invoke any metaphysical intervention. Numeric simulations using simple models of ecosystem evolution convincingly show the trend of increasing complexity too. And he mentions that just as with models of computer networks, they appear to have intelligent design, they actually learn by themselves. And he mentions the second law of thermodynamics down here. Note that seems to defy the second law of thermodynamics, but remember, we are dealing with open systems. So anyway, he mentions that. Hang on a second here. I have to cough up a bee or something that got into my lungs out there. And then up here, he has an interesting negative example. Let me give you a comparative negative example. Astrology works. It works because of the peculiar way our brains operate. Programmed to remember only the relevant information, it tends to forget or not store at all information on irrelevant or inconsequential happenings. So when an astrologer or the daily horoscope in a newspaper makes a series of totally random predictions, we will remember those that did come true and forget all others, basically. So we only see the parts that came true, and out of this random set of information, we'll say, oh my God, that was amazing. It happened just the way I thought it would. But it's because we forget all of the irrelevant information. And he makes
we'll remember what we wanted to hear or needed to hear.
Yeah,
right.
It's called a selective bias.
Yeah, it's confirmation bias or whatever. Yep. And then we got the paper itself, and we'll figure out how we're going to do this. Let's see. Oh my goodness. Okay, I'm going to do a few things here, make a few adjustments. Share screen.
Like pareidolia.
Now I want to mention
that
that
aren't always there, like seeing a face in a helicopter.
Yeah. This is one of the papers that creationists like to talk about. And this is 2015, and it's by Mr. Roederer. It's called Pragmatic Information in Biology and Physics. And I figured out how to get rid of these things. Let's see, get rid of the sidebar, hide sidebar. There you go. Okay, so now we're not quite full screen, but I think this is a full screen paper. I don't know. Let's see down below. Yeah, it is. Good. Okay. So anyway, we could start reading at the beginning. If somebody wants to be Scott.
What?
What?
What, you want to read the abstract? Okay.
Me?
I will show.
Damn it, Speed.
I will show how an objective definition of the concept of information and the consideration of recent results about information processing in the human brain help clarify some fundamental aspects of physics and biology, rather than attempting to define information ab initio, which I guess means like from the beginning.
Ab initio means is it means like from basically like from first principles.
Okay.
Like from the ground up.
Gotcha.
Or from the beginning for us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For those of you lesser Chads, it means from the beginning.
Yeah. But it's cooler when you say ab initio.
Yeah. Latin always makes it cooler. I introduced the concept of interaction between material bodies as a primary concept. Two distinct categories can be identified. Interactions which can always be reduced to a superposition of physical interactions, forces between elementary constituents, and interactions between complex bodies which cannot be expressed as a superposition of interactions between parts, and in which patterns and forms in space and time play the determining role. Pragmatic information is then defined as the link between a given pattern and the ensuing pattern-specific change. I will show that pragmatic information is a biological concept. It plays no active role in the purely physical domain. It only does so when a living organism intervenes. The consequences for physics, including foundations of quantum mechanics, and biology, including brain function, will be discussed. This will include speculations about three fundamental transitions from the quantum to the classic domains, from natural inanimate to living systems, and from subhuman to human brain information processing operations, introduced here in their direct connection with the concept of pragmatic information. So I'm suspecting that maybe something about this living organism intervening, does that appeal to the creationists? Is that the paper?
That would be a great quote mine for them.
Yeah, and I guess also there's the in one place somewhere in the paper, the idea of a bit is mentioned, and then an idea of a qubit, which is some sort of quantum thing. But so given that some of the people we've observed in the past have had really, wanted to talk about bits and bytes of information, and therefore God must have, been the designer. That must be their interest in this paper, but this paper is about much more than that, or isn't really about, I think, what it's thought to be about.
Well, there are some creationist channels that will tell you that just because it's pragmatic information, that therefore it must be, an intelligent designer, which is kind of bullshit.
That's the good kind of American information, pragmatic.
Oh yeah, the good kind. Yep. So debunked. I'm looking up a channel. Okay.
Physics, biology, and information. It is quite understandable that terms of such everyday usage as information and knowledge remain largely undefined in the general scientific literature. Yet, given some new ideas and experimental results from the field of biology about these concepts, it is time to revisit some fundamental aspects of various scientific disciplines. For instance, physicists are accustomed to dot, 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 dot,
Oh, I'm sorry. I've been paying attention.
accustomed to working with the Shannon and algorithmic information. I put a "the" in there where I shouldn't have. However, when the concept of information is used in this generic, not specifically quantitative sense, they seldom take into account that one is really talking about pragmatic information, like in information on the state of a quantum system, information deposited in or extracted from the environment. The field carries retarded information about its sources, information about the microstate of a gas, information swallowed by a black hole, etc. It is most biologists, particularly geneticists and neuroscientists, who make an explicit distinction between Shannon or statistical information, bit number, novelty, probability of occurrence, regardless of purpose or effect. Algorithmic information, minimum number of binary steps to define something, numerical values. Oh, yeah, there was a pause there. Numerical values of physical variables. And pragmatic information, representing purpose and effect. Of these three classes of information, the last one is most relevant for biology. Indeed, the notion of quantity of information is often of secondary importance, which counts, or what counts is what information ultimately does and not how many bits are involved.
Okay.
Pardon me.
Go ahead.
As I argue in Roederer, footnote 2 or reference to.
That is a reference to his book. So.
Okay. Pragmatic information is a purely biological concept. This seems difficult to accept for physicists, yet one must not forget the rather trivial fact that physics is the product of information processing by brains, based on interactions of systems chosen and prepared by brains, measured with the artifacts or instruments created by brains, using algorithms, mathematics, and models developed by brains, and following plans, purposes, and quantitative predictions made by brains. Sorry.
This is why I had to read this, Scott.
I know, yeah. Scott,
I have a feeling that the idea of brains here is going to become a very recurring and important concept.
I think so. It's important to Mr. Roederer, just like it is to a zombie. The principal obstacle in an effort to persuade physicists to accept the idea of information being a purely biological concept seems to be the perceived lack of a widely accepted definition of pragmatic information that is truly objective. In other words, unrelated to any human use or practice. Rather than attempting to define information ab initio, it is more appropriate to start with the concept of interaction between bodies as the primary concept or epistemological primitive. We can identify two distinct categories. Number one, interactions which can always be reduced to a linear superposition of physical interactions, in other words, forces between the interacting systems' elementary constituents, and in which there is energy coupling between the parts. And number two, interactions which cannot be expressed quantitatively as a superposition of elementary interactions, but in which patterns and forms in space and or time play the determining role on whether or not an interaction is to take place, and in which the required energy must be provided from outside through a specific interaction mechanism.
Okay.
Examples of category 1, which we call force-driven interactions, are all the physical interactions between elementary particles, wave fields, nuclei, atoms, molecules, parcels of fluids, solid bodies, planets, and stars. Ultimately, these originate in 4 basic interactions between fundamental particles: electromagnetic, gravitational, strong, and weak.
Okay.
All right. Guess I'll go.
Okay, sure.
Oh, I thought you wanted to take a break.
Well, no,
Okay.
I did cough, but
Yeah. The simplest case of an interaction of category 2 is any arrangement in which the presence of a specific pattern in a complex system S leads to a causal, macroscopic, and univocal change in another system R. A change that would not happen or just occur by chance in the absence of the particular pattern at the source. Typical examples range from effects on the respective chemical networks of the one-dimensional pattern of bases in the DNA or RNA molecule, or the three-dimensional shape of a folded protein. The light patterns detected by the ommatidia of an insect and resulting ommatidia of an insect and resulting shape of its flight orbit around a light source. The patterns of neural electrical signals in one region of the brain triggering signals in another, to the perceived print patterns changing the state of knowledge in a reader's brain.
Yep, and I just saw a brain bug as soon as you said ommatidia. So those are the little components of an insect eye.
Okay, great.
Okay. I figured people needed to know that. Okay.
Pragmatic information is then defined as that which represents the univocal correspondence pattern change, or univocal pattern to change. It is the reason why we call to the category of information-driven interactions. Okay. By univocal, we mean that the interaction process is deterministic and must yield identical results when repeated under similar conditions of preparation. When an information-driven interaction has occurred, we say that the pragmatic information was transferred from the source S, where the pattern resides, to the recipient R, where the pattern-specific change occurs. We emphasize that in this definition, the concept of pattern refers to any physical, geometrical, topological property of points in space and/or instance of time that distinguishes them from all others. They include, but are not limited to, symbols, to which one can assign syntactic and semantic definitions. Information-driven interactions all require a complex interaction mechanism with a reset function, often considered part of one of the interacting bodies, and which ultimately provides the energy required to effect the specific change. Although we call them interactions, they are causally unidirectional, from source to recipient. However, the designation interaction is justified in the sense that, to occur, they require some pre-established match, sometimes called understanding, between source and recipient. In the preceding, we do not imply that information resides in the patterns. The concept of pragmatic information is one of relationship between patterns and changes, mediated by some interaction mechanism. A pattern all by itself has no meaning or function.
Yep. So, what do you think so far?
I think he's making a good point. I mean, he's saying basically, look, if you have like just a pattern that exists, it doesn't mean anything at all unless there's some kind of relationship you can assign it to.
Yeah.
There has to be some way of kind of like quantifying it. Is his fundamental point? It appears.
Yeah, and I think he makes a point with physics later on that that basically a lot of what we find in physics we find because we do the same thing as we're doing with astrology. We're picking out the parts that are interesting to us to measure, and when we measure something, we get what we measure, right? So it's kind of.
I mean, there's a mathematical argument like that physicists will make that says essentially kind of the results of physics that we have, may well just occur because, in the history of mathematics, people have been interested in certain objects, and instead of developing a better mathematical system or a better logical system to describe the universe, we went the simple route and decided to use mathematics and improve and refine it over time. Yeah. Because that's a system that's existed and that's been well studied and can be appropriated to the realm of science.
Yep. Okay.
All right. There are only three fundamental processes through which mechanisms of information-driven interactions can emerge. Two involving processes that are vastly different timescales: Darwinian evolution, adaptation or neural learning. One, Darwinian evolution. Two, adaptation or neural learning. Three, as the result of human reasoning and long-term planning. In other words, they all involve living matter. Indeed, information-driven interactions represent the defining property of life. The first process is ultimately responsible for the emergence of the molecular ensembles of lipid membranes that allow encapsulated organic material to maintain a low entropy state of quasi-equilibrium with the environment, and the appearance of information-bearing molecules like DNA and related molecular machines, like ribosomes, to translate stored information into a chemical action. For a detailed discussion of a fundamental informational operation in a cell, see 7. The second process above endows multicellular organisms with mechanisms to survive in a changing environment. The third process, uniquely human, represents the ultimate origin of planned and manufactured artifacts and the development of arts and sciences.
Yeah. So he's kind of making the case that we are sort of a special kind of information processor, we humans.
Yeah, I think so.
And we're kind of at the pinnacle of this drive from forming lipid membranes to our minds, basically the kind of planning that humans are capable of, which not too many other animals are.
Well, it's not quite that. I mean, we know from various neurological studies that animals have some ability to plan,
right?
But usually it's like seconds to minutes in advance, sometimes hours, right? But it's never like humans are able to do this on timescales of, say, years to decades to sometimes even centuries.
Yep.
Right? Humans are able to project. Humans are uniquely able to kind of project information about their current environment, and try to plan for things that are well beyond the present quote unquote time. To things that won't occur within sometimes even our lifetime. I mean, 100 years from now, I'm probably not going to be around. So.
Yeah, we discovered yesterday and the day before, we caught a raccoon out by the garbage can sitting in the windowsill. And then yesterday I found a steak bone on the ground, and we realized that all along these raccoons have been going into our garbage and picking food and eating it and managing to close the garbage can so that nobody ever knew they were there. And I'm guessing that would require a little planning. And normally, you'd find garbage all over, but no, they're very neat. The only sign we had is a steak bone, and I think one of them forgot to clean that up. So I think they've been hauling them off somewhere, but we figured them out.
We got them, boys.
So that takes a little bit of planning, and I've got one that's been trying to undo my fence screws for like 6 months now. He's been working on it. But anyway, they plan a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's it's a significant example, but I don't think it's equivalent to the type of like timescales that humans operate in or are able to operate in.
We believe we're special. But the 3 time scales here, the Darwinian evolution, adaptation, and neural learning, which occurs, in our brains, and then human reasoning, which is somewhat beyond that. It's like we managed to add a few new brain parts that allowed us to go a lot further than these other bits of information. So,
I mean, if you wanted to, you could argue that 3 is perhaps like a subcategory of 2, in the sense that as neural learning kind of gets refined and specialized within species, that gives rise to 3.
Yeah,
and that's there's some consensus regarding that, like within human evolution and things like that.
Okay.
All right. Where are we? We're information driven. Okay. Any information-driven interaction between inanimate complex systems must ultimately be life-generated or designed. Shouldn't have said that. Requiring at some stage goal directed actions by a living system. Examples are the physical effects of a beaver dam on water flow, mechanical effects of a tool used by a corvoid, flight path controlled by an autopilot, etc. Clearly, what distinguishes life systems from purely complex physical systems is that the former, in addition to force-driven interactions, are capable of information-driven interactions in which the relevant triggering factor is patterns in space and time.
Okay.
Note that all information-driven interactions, whether purely biological or in a human-controlled scientific experiment, affect the normal, quote-unquote, non-biological course related to the causal architecture mentioned in Walker et al., number 7. At the molecular...
I'm saying, he's also one of the people that wrote in this same issue, 2016 of the Royal Society, which has all those information articles, Walker. So
okay,
anyway.
nice. Let's go back to the previous statement. Yeah.
Right after Walker.
At the molecular intercellular level of physical and chemical events, information-driven interactions all involve complex systems in the classical domain, in which time sequences which fulfilled the dictates of causality, locality, special relativity, and thermodynamics. It is important to emphasize that information-driven interactions do function on the basis of force-driven interactions between their components. What counts is how these purely physical components are put together in the interaction mechanism. The informational architecture of Walker et al.
Yep.
The concept of information. Do you want to read?
Go ahead. Oh, no.
Okay. The concept of information does not appear as an active controlling agent in a purely physical interaction process in the universe. It appears there. It only appears there when a life system in general or any observer in a laboratory intervenes. In other words, the world out there works without information processing until a living system intervenes and changes the physical course. The above-mentioned beaver dam is an example. In physics, when we state that a system of mass points follows a path of least action, we do not mean that the system possesses the necessary information to choose a path of minimum action from among infinite possibilities, but that it is we humans who have discovered how systems of mass points evolve and who have developed a mathematical method applicable to all to predict or retrodict their motions. Similar arguments can be made when we describe black holes as swallowing information, or decoherence as carrying away information on a quantum system. Further examples are found in the association between entropy and information, which arises from the way we scientists describe, analyze, and manipulate nature. For instance, by counting molecules in a pre-parceled phase space, coarse graining, averaging over preconceived domains, looking for regularities versus disorder, predicting fluctuations, extracting mechanical work based on observed patterns and systems, or mentally tagging molecules according to their initial states.
Okay, now here's where he takes a deep dive into physics, I think, and I think maybe we can skip almost all of the paper and refer our readers who are interested, or maybe a Leo session to get into it from here on. That sort of thing for him in this letter.
This might be good for Leo to go into, and me and him to kind of talk about it and read before diving into this, because if it hits physics, it's going to hit hard.
Yeah, there is something interesting here. Okay, in this latter context, let us discuss a concrete example, which also will be helpful later. We turn to the Gibbs paradox. Consider two vessels A and B of equal volume joined by a tube with closed valve, thermally isolated from the rest and filled with the same gas at the same pressure and temperature. If we open the valve, nothing will happen thermodynamically. But at the microscopic level, we can picture in our mind the molecules of A expanding in the vessel B and the molecules of B expanding in A. And each process would represent an adiabatic expansion with an increase of entropy. But so there should be a total increase of entropy of the system by that formula. This, of course, is absurd and represents Gibbs' paradox. In most books, it is somewhat lamely explained away by saying that the formula used here are indeed correct, but apply only if the gases in the two vessels are different. However, little but physically distinguishable, different gases are just left-handed and right-handed specimens of the same molecule. So they're the same gas. And he makes the case, so what is wrong with the conclusions of the above thought experiment? By invoking the concept of pragmatic information, when we say that we can picture in our mind the molecules in a vessel A doing this or that, we are labeling them, okay? So we're saying that these same molecules, so as to make them different from others. In other words, we are assuming that there's a pre-established pattern. This molecule is from A and that one's from B. However, this pattern and any extractable information from it do not exist in reality. So he's sort of I would push back on him for this, because what he's talking about, if we have 2 electrons, right? Or if we have multiple electrons, they're all the same. They're the same exact things. And there's no difference in them. But still, they're different because of where they are in space-time. So that's kind of the point he's making, and that's Gibbs paradox. So most of what he talks about in physics is how we have this like bias, or this human bias of finding or imagining meaning by labeling things. And in the above, he's claiming that labeling these as different molecules makes no sense. There is no difference, or they're actually the same molecules. So there is no change when you open the valve.
Or we impose locality on certain molecules. Theoretically, it's a thought experiment.
Yeah.
But in reality, that doesn't matter.
Yeah, it doesn't matter to the physical system, but still, it does matter in some way, because 2 identical things spinning around each other, have like a location in space. And that's where it gets kind of spooky when you start thinking about the difference in space and time of physical objects which are identical, and whether or not that has any meaning at all. So anyway, and let's see where we go from here. I'm not sure where we go from here. Let's take a look at our sidebar.
Basically, go past the equations. That would help. But there's still a lot of written physics and quantum type data that it would just be helpful to have somebody analyze who is competent in that field.
Yeah, we could probably skip some of that, go on to physics, brains, and information. So somebody want to read this?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it.
Just for that. Let's see where it goes.
Okay, since the beginning of quantum mechanics, physicists have been arguing about whether the observer and his or her state of knowledge, even consciousness, play an active role in the quantum measurement process. However, they did not have the benefit of knowing what is known today about the biophysical mechanisms and the control of human brain function. Recent studies with functional magnetic resonance imaging, positron emission tomography, diffusion tensor imaging, and at the neural network level, multi-microelectrode recordings are confirming a hypothesis long in use by neurophysicists and computer scientists, namely that the information being processed in the brain is encoded in real time as a task-specific spatio-temporal distribution of neural activity in certain regions of the cerebral cortex. For instance, say what?
A mouthful.
It is a mouthful. For instance, given a shiny red apple, specific neuroelectrical impulse distributions arise in parts of the prefrontal lobes and in certain regions of the visual cortex and temporal and parietal lobes that are nearly the same whether we see, hear about, think, or just dream of that red apple. Only the order in which they appear will depend on whether we are perceiving, imagining, or remembering. In summary, if a certain specific pattern of neural activity distribution here triggers because of neural interconnectivity a specific distribution there and does so in a univocal way within limits, we are in the presence of an information-based interaction between 2 cerebral regions. The pragmatic information involved represents that specific relationship, and we usually say that the information has been transferred from one cerebral region to another.
Okay, so should we try to unpack that?
Yeah, I think earlier he defines univocal in his way, so we might need to run back and find that.
It's sort of his wanting to, let's see, univocal way within limits. We are in presence of information base. There it does. So, well, I don't know if that's probably a red herring.
Yeah.
So basically, he's explaining, and I would push back on one thing. He says that they're almost identical, but they're not, because the neural networks are a lot fuzzier than that. But anyway, he's saying that, the red apple is going to trigger some set of neurons. We were talking about that last night with cognates. We were saying that, there's a concept of a red apple, and that that particular pattern is going to keep firing whether you remember it, imagine it, or see it. So there's that similarity. So in a sense, as you live your life, you will accumulate basically this pattern of information that so that one could say represents a red apple, but representationalism has its own issues. Hang on a second. Because there's nothing for it to be represented to. Basically, when you see the red apple, there is the firing of those neurons, and there is no viewer to see that representation. So that's the problem. And I am choking on something. Anyway, so he's making the point that there's this spatial temporal distribution of neural activity, which is information rich, that sort of thing. Somebody can go on.
All right, I'll continue. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. When a scientist makes a measurement, the pragmatic information involved represents the correlation between an external pattern, in other words, the location in space of a rigid body, the position of the dial in an instrument, the dots on cast dice, the color change of a solution, with a specific spatiotemporal pattern of neural activity in the prefrontal lobes corresponding to the knowledge. It is this particular state and not any other possible one. The actual information processing mechanisms in the brain linking one neural distribution with another are controlled by the actual synaptic wiring, which in certain regions, especially the hippocampus, has the ability to undergo specific changes as a function of use, plasticity, the physiological expression of stable stored pragmatic information or long-term memory. Modern neurobiology has an answer to the common question, when does a specific distribution of neural firings actually become a mental image? This neural activity distribution does not become anything. It is the image. And I think we need to underline that, because that is kind of a boom moment, at least for me, because, I'd always thought of like an image in our minds as some sort of emergent thing rather than actually being that neural activity that's somehow been activated in our minds.
Yeah, that's the thing. When you start thinking about the brain and in our mind, what you have to understand over and over again is this statement: this neural activity distribution does not become anything, and it's not viewed by anything. It's not viewed by anybody. There is no homunculus. It is the image. So
now,
when you're...
That would be very controversial to fundamentalists reading this.
Yeah, that would be. Yeah. They believe there's a homunculus soul viewing everything.
Yeah.
So, which simply pushes the problem back one level, right? So, it just removes it one level up, and there's no need for that. And it's a very difficult thing to get your mind around. Anyway, okay, go ahead.
In summary, the dynamic spatiotemporal distribution of neural impulses and the quasi-static spatial distribution of synapses and their efficiencies together are the physical realization of the global state of a functioning brain at any instant of time. Another way of expressing this pragmatic information is encoded in the brain dynamically in short-term patterns of neural impulses and statically in the long-term patterns of synaptic architecture. Quite generally, animal brains handle pragmatic information in sequences of information-driven interactions in which one specific spatiotemporal pattern of neural activity is mapped or transformed into another neural pattern in its most basic form, from a physically triggered sensory or interoceptive stimulation pattern to a neural output pattern of stimulating muscle and gland fibers, thus governing the animal's integral behavior. These processes may change the interconnectivity, synaptic architecture of participating neural networks, leading to long-term storage of information. A memory recall consists of the replay of the original neural activity distribution that had led to the synaptic change during memory storage. The most important type is the associative recall, in which the replay is triggered by a cue embedded in the ongoing neural activity distribution. For some examples, see reference 2. Expressed in terms of pragmatic information in the act of remembering or imagining a red apple, information on red apples stored in the synaptic architecture of the brain is retro-transferred, mostly through subcortical networks, to the visual cortex and or other sensory areas. In the form of neural activity specific to the actual perception of red apples, neuroscientists call the specific microscopic distribution of neural activity responsible for any subjective experience a neural correlate. Now, my emphasis was a little bit off, my inflection.
Yeah.
But,
I just want to mention that when you imagine things, they found out that surprisingly that 90% of the neurons are basically coming from the different parts of your brain into the visual cortex, and 10% goes the other way. So the part that your eye sees is about 10% of the picture. So there's a 90% feedback happening from the front part of your brain. So it's like a feedback loop, but it's strongly in favor of you imagining things into your visual cortex.
So
that's why
it takes the image that you see, and that just goes into all sorts of different places in your brain.
It's highly processed.
The image itself, but associated, feelings or whatever that come along with what you're seeing as well.
Right. Yeah, and it's also highly processed, so that when you see a cup, like if you take a high dose of psychedelic drugs, all of that goes to hell. That feedback coming from the front goes to hell, and you primarily see what's in your visual cortex, which, because you're moving your eyes around constantly, they're called saccades, ends up being a really strange view, and that's why people will talk about walls melting, under the influence of psychedelics, and it's because that's what your sensory system is capable of actually seeing, but we process it into solid objects and tangible things that we know and have seen before. So there's a lot of processing coming from the top that stabilizes the madness that is going on in your senses. Otherwise, we would drive ourselves mad with the amount of input we were getting.
Yeah, you have to filter out some stuff because everything will drive you crazy.
Right, and that filtering process oftentimes leads to boredom because you tend to filter out everything but the conceptual object that you've remembered. And so you end up not participating fully in the world in the way that you can. And that's also why psychedelic drugs are sometimes pleasant to experience, because suddenly you feel everything again. And and it's like you've never seen it before. It's like you're seeing it for the first time, which is interesting. So I just want to stick that in there. I hope Kafai doesn't pop up. Goddamn. Because I said psychedelic drugs 3 times, didn't I?
That's right. And of course, we talked about mushrooms yesterday somewhere.
He did pop up eventually.
Yeah.
I did see him.
Let me continue. May I continue?
You can continue.
Let us point out at this stage that in the definition of pragmatic information, it is often the case that different source patterns can lead to the same change in the recipient. In other words, or for example, different shape sizes and tones of red of an apple still trigger the neural pattern that defines the concept or image of red apple. Likewise, the same source pattern can lead to different effects depending on collateral information processing activity of the system. All this is quite germane to the study of cognition in neuroscience.
I'm going to move. Human brain is going toward the top.
All right. The human brain can recall stored information at will as images or representations, manipulate them, discover overlooked correlations, and restore modified or amended versions thereof without any concurrent example or somatic input. It can go offline. Now, I don't know. I've tried to remember things at will and had some trouble with it lately, so that may not be so true. This is information generation par excellence and represents the human thinking process. Internally triggered human brain images, however abstract, are the snippets expressed as many different but distinct patterns of neural activity in specific regions of the cortex, derived from stored information acquired in earlier sensory or mental events and pieced together in different ways under some central control, the main program linked to human consciousness. I want to pause here and make a make a literary note here, because what the heck is up with all these freaking parentheses? I don't know. If you want the information contained therein to add to the topic, write it out in a paragraph and a sentence that flow. Too many of these paragraphs essentially either restating or adding information don't need to be there. They need to be a separate sentence or a separate paragraph, and just do the work, because it's awfully distracting to
I can explain it.
Okay.
There was a shipment of parentheses coming from China going to Russia, and it crashed into Alaska, and this is where he lives. So in Alaska, they have a lot of parentheses laying around left over, and they're very inexpensive in Alaska.
Very
periods on
parentheses, huh?
Yeah, they don't have a lot of periods, but they got a lot of parentheses.
Must be, because my gosh, there's just stuff in there. All right, that was my rant about literary stuff, writing.
Want to take over Mutable? Where's the Mutable?
He dropped out. I don't know. Check your private chat, because I got the screen blown up here.
Gonna get going? What do you mean you're gonna get going? Get going where?
Well, apparently he had somewhere to be and didn't realize that.
Yeah, and he didn't quite tell us. So
this would take more than half an hour. Since when? Yeah. Since when have we done one of these papers in less than a half hour?
Yeah, I know. So I wonder if we should skip ahead to the. Does he have a conclusion?
Yeah.
Yeah, we can probably skip ahead, and I'll go ahead and spell you for a minute.
Okay.
Read. Okay, so I think let's see. I thought this paper was short. Okay, information and fundamental transitions, quantum, classical, non-life, life, and infrahuman, human. In the preceding sections, we have identified two categories of information between bodies or system components of the universe as we know it: force-driven and information-driven. The first category is assumed to be operating in the entire spatio-temporal domain from the Planck scale up. The second category leads to the definition of pragmatic information as representing a physical, causal, and univocal correspondence between a pattern and a specific macroscopic change elicited by some complex interaction mechanism. Let me see. I think we might be able to abbreviate more of this paper by looking at his book, because this guy's pretty wordy.
Yeah, we're getting into eigenvalues and eigenstates and
eigenvalues and linear algebra, experimental facts.
That was a slog to get through when I read the paper.
Important fact for our discussion is that we ensemble. Let's see.
We definitely need to get Leo up in here and go over that section of the paper and see what it has to add to this, because I'm interested. I just need a little coaching.
Okay, we'll go right to the last paragraph. Let us summarize this section as viewed by a human agent in biological terms. The quantum domain is defined as one in which pragmatic information does not and cannot operate. The classical domain is one from which pragmatic information can be extracted. The domain of life is one in which pragmatic information can be processed. It doesn't say anything else. Information-driven interactions can take place. And the domain of human-like intelligence is where pragmatic information on past, present, and future is created in real time. From the perspective of purely force-driven interactions, e.g., in the world devoid of life systems, there are no separable domains. So going to his book, I wonder if there's more that we could discuss there before closing this out. Let me see here.
Statement was that? Do you see that as like a metaphysical statement about information?
I see it as sort of a comment, like I see it as sort of a caution to us that we do interpret these things in a human way.
Mm-hmm.
And we see things often that aren't there, you know, this pareidolia thing.
Yeah.
And he makes, let's see if I can find in his book, Representation of Information in Biological Systems. So let me stop the screen. His book is actually much better than this paper. And after we decided to read the paper, I almost rejected it because he didn't make a very good case, I don't think. So let me see here if I can find some highlights. Transient pattern. Okay, he's talking about, he talks about the information in DNA. You know, it's forming this linear information, which by itself means nothing. Mm-hmm. It only means something in relation to the ribosome and being translated into proteins and the other things that affect the cell, basically. That it's this, and then the proteins themselves have a shape, which he gets into about macromolecules, and he often referred to as a template. You know, that the proteins have a certain shape, and by virtue of that shape has information. Other shapes have similar information, and the two things can actually lock together. Okay. Mm-hmm. So it's like information locking on the information. And he gets quite far into talking about the difference between Shannon information, which would be the information in that series of DNA or proteins, and the folded, more expansive form of information in life. And then he talks a little bit about how that information can arise on its own by putting in energy. So, and that was the end of this section, is where we started out looking at his book. But
gotcha.
There's quite a bit in here.
Written after the book or before the book?
I think the paper was written after the book because it refers to the book.
Oh well,
the book was written in 2005.
Okay,
and he even gets one thing wrong about ribosomes. He says that they're proteins that translate the DNA. They're actually mostly RNA. The RNA is the most important part of a ribosome.
Well,
as we can see, that's
why biologists should have been on this paper.
Yeah, but he knows quite a bit, and he makes a pretty good case here. And he's talking about the genetic code. And let's see, here he talks a little bit. I can't remember where it is. First, each one of the 20 amino acids. He talks about how that code statistically looks like it basically arose by itself. Let's see, I think it's right here. The stop sign, correlates, accidental. It hardly can be an accidental feature. Okay, and there's another quote mine for creationists right there.
Yeah,
there's indeed evidence from computer simulation studies that the specific relation between the 64 codons and the 20 amino acids and the stop sign in the code offers an optimal adaptive language or advantage, right? Uh-huh. So basically it formed statistically from the fact of the amino acids and the codons, and it's kind of interesting. But yeah, this guy is really a great quote mine for creationism.
Yeah,
but you need to read this whole section to see where he's going.
Exactly, and that's the problem with some other readers of certain persuasions, because they want to just grab those little things that seem to have words that fit what they want them to mean, and we come up with a quote mine instead of really getting what valuable information you can out of the paper itself.
So Randolph, are you complaining that we skipped over a huge chunk of the paper? we bracketed it, basically. I think so. Anyway.
Well, maybe
Yeah,
Randolph can come in and explain some of that physics to us, man. We'd love to see you.
Come on, Randolph.
Come on. He may have fallen asleep already to the soothing tones of my voice reading.
Anyway, so I think we can call it quits on this one. So the paper is linked in the description, unless am I wrong about that? I'm not wrong. No, I'm not wrong about that. It's linked in the description. Yeah. And you can go out and look at that. No, it was a pun on racket. Oh, I see. Okay. I thought you were complaining that we didn't read the whole thing. Because,
well, you know, I'm sure he wasn't.
We'll go back and read
a 10-page scientific paper to him.
Yeah.
But, yeah, we do need to present this paper to Leo, have him look at it, and then come on and us talk about it based on the sections on physics that the author appeals to. It might be beneficial. It might be helpful. He could maybe clear up inform us of some topics and clear up some of the muddled part of it.
Yeah, and it might do me good to finish reading this section because I mean in the entire book this is pretty much all he has on biomolecules. The rest is in physics and a whole bunch of other things.
Yeah.
Representation of information in biomolecular systems, and it's about I think it's about 10 pages long or something like that. And
Randolph is showing quite a bit of wisdom here. I like that you read actual papers. This is always cool.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. I always knew you were an astute and sensitive gentleman, Randolph.
We have more people watching than usual. Usually we get about 6 people watching our paper reading, and we have 12 now. So.
Yeah, and
but we only have 9 likes.
Did I interrupt the point you were trying to make?
Did I make a point?
To highlight Randolph? I'm
not sure if I was trying to make a point or not. That was a long time ago.
I gotta be careful. If I speak too soon, then I'll ruin your flow of thought. But before we go, I just wanted to say thanks to Brainbug and Woolly Ignorant and Chris Peacock. And I hope I don't miss anybody.
Jason Torn.
And Jason Torn is here.
Scott Duke is here.
Yeah, but he's a loser. Just ignore him.
You know, Woolly Ignorant. You got him. Yep.
Yes,
anyway, Brainbug has been in the chat. Brainbug. I caught a bunch of bugs last night, and holy shit, are they interesting!
Well, I hope he's still listening. You know, he might have snoozed off during the first half of the reading. Yeah. Oh, there's Robert and David.
Oh, if I saw something about rolling papers.
Oh, rolling papers. Okay.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, we can roll this up for you. You know, we can stuff some bugs in there and other things that I would, consider worth smoking.
Well, okay. Then I apologize to Scott Duke for calling him a loser.
Yep.
Randolph is so very smart about all this stuff that obviously if I'm wrong about it, I'm wrong about it. So thank you, Randolph, for setting me in the right direction.
Yeah, but that's just one opinion.
That's like your opinion, man.
Okay, guys. So I think we can end this. And I'm going to try to do this right today. What do you think? Do you think I can do it right?
In the show?
Yeah, I need that longer logo reveal thing that pauses to give me time because I have to cut it off. Otherwise, we pop back up. But anyway,
and you know what?
Goodbye.
I was going to say, probably it might not be bad to figure out a way to start a 30-second kind of sign-off music, to where people will become trained to realize, oh, he's about to stop because the music's playing. And then play the post-show music.
Is there a Goodbye Cruel World song that we could use? Maybe, You mean Happy Trails?
Like by Pink Floyd?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. There we go. Or Happy Trails by Roy Rogers and Dale
Yeah,
Evans.
that's always a good one. I like that.
Yeah, I
But-
didn't get a copyright strike for that, so I might be able to work that one in. So anyway, surprising that I don't get a copyright strike because Roy Rogers and Dale Evans got together, and she was, just a girl, and she managed to sign a deal where she got royalties for her family forever on everything they ever did.
Wow.
And she became very rich, whereas Roy Rogers did not have that deal.
Oh no.
So she just took them to the cleaners and that's why I'm surprised we don't get a copyright strike, because I think her estate is still collecting money from anything related to Roy Rogers and Dale Evans, which is pretty cool. So way to go, Dale Evans. You fucking showed the men. And when they signed the papers, I think there was something about she knew what she was doing, but the studio and the producers and everybody else didn't really have a clue what they were signing up for.
Yeah.
And which I thought was kind of a neat side story to a couple of old cowboys from the 1950s, right?
Yeah, that's not bad. You see this message from Robert wanting to know about outgoing message for the weather report?
Let's see, outgoing message for the weather report. I'm not sure if I saw that.
Okay, have you noticed this? Jason is telling us that there's a stupid meme out on atheists.
Oh, yeah. Of course, LPP, we'll cover that in the weather report tomorrow. I'll take a look, Jason. Let's see. So, Robert Seeds, I don't know if I got your email. I think I did. And we need to do that. But I think I've got to get Peter to work on it for me. So anyway, okay, we are shooting this in the head right now. Okay, so
Sure. That's fine.
Goodbye, cruel world.